Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and the title of our project is Climate Scenarios for Managing Grassland Ecosystems in the Great Plains. Our team includes Sarah Brookins, Brody Loomis, Lauren Mullen, and myself, Madeline Zenner. Our amazing mentors include Bill Travis, Imtiaz Rangwala, and Prasad Thoda. We want to acknowledge that the CU Boulder campus resides on the traditional territories of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne nations. And the primary point location that we gathered our data from resides on the traditional Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. Our project focuses on ecosystems located within the US Great Plains. Grassland ecosystems in this region are largely controlled by climate. Therefore, we will be utilizing climate projection data to see how the changing climate affects grassland productivity. Visualizing these scenarios helps resource managers make choices when dealing with the land management, infrastructure, and agriculture in a sustainable and effective way. Next slide, please. The two main questions that we wanted to answer with this project were, first, what is the correlation between climate and grassland production? And the second being, what is the likely future path of climate and grassland conditions in a changing climate? And these will be answered in the context of the Great Plains region. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there are two main reasons we chose the Great Plains region as our area of focus. First is that for humans, the grasslands are very important for agriculture and food production. The second reason is that the ecology of the Great Plains is incredibly diverse and is one of only 4 remaining intact temperate grasslands in the world. Conservation management of the Great Plains will be important as the effects of climate change threaten the grasslands and all of the species that call this region home. Next. So we gathered data from 3 different locations within the grasslands region. Within the Great Plains region, and we chose to focus most of our attention on the Central Plains Experimental Range in Weld County, Colorado. We decided to look at the other locations to test the reproducibility of our code, but we're not going to have enough time to go over the results of that today. Next slide, please. So before we get into the specifics of the project, I just want to go over some important terminology and definitions. The first variable is ANPP, which stands for above ground net primary production. And this is calculated through measuring plant biomass. So when ANPP is high, it means that the plants are essentially bigger, producing more. PET stands for potential evapotranspiration. This is a measure of evaporation from the soils and transpiration of water from plants into the atmosphere. And this can be thought of as the thirst of the atmosphere. And PET is higher with higher temperatures, but there are also other factors that go into calculating this value, such as wind speed and other variables. And then precipitation is water produced from the atmosphere, so rainfall. And then PET minus precipitation is what we focus a lot of our attention on. And this value combines the thirst of the atmosphere with the water production. A good way to think about it is the water deficit. And then we also studied just the time period of April through May, because this is when plants are the most productive in the year. So next slide. So onto our methods and tools. Using a web application called Climate Toolbox, we were able to download GridMet CSV files containing historical evapotranspiration and precipitation data. We were also able to choose future MACA projection models and scenarios. And using a website called Grasscast, we were able to obtain historical ANPP data from our selected locations. We also used Google Colab in order to generate all of our analyses. Next slide, please. So we'll go into more detail about our methods in each step, but this isn't just a flowchart of how our process went. And we're not going to have much time to go into the flowchart right now, but there is more information about this on our blog post if you're interested. And then I'm going to pass this on to Sarah to talk more about our methods.
Awesome. So I'm going to be talking about a main focus of our project, which was linking climate and grassland accumulation. And so our data for the grassland production was from GrassCast using ANPP observations. And for our climate data, we have the precipitation, the supply, PET, which is the demand, and the difference between the two, which is the water deficit. And the data used here was from GridMet for the past data and MACA for the future. And so using our historical data, we were able to determine the strongest relationship between these variables was ANPP versus precipitation and ANPP versus the water deficit using the R-square values from our best fit line. And so we chose to look at the relationship between ANPP and the water deficit because it better represents the system as a whole. So why our linear regression is so important is we used it to get our future ANPP values. So we used a application in Python called the NumPy package, and it was to create our line of best fit for the scatter plots. So using the Y equation we generated from our linear regression, we were able to plug in our observed ANPP values and projected future climate data from climate models to infer what future grassland production might look like. And with all that being said, let's get into the future climate models and how we chose them. So these climate scenarios are generated by the Climate Model Intercomparison Project, which we were able to utilize from Climate Toolbox. And they use historical climate data as well as atmospheric carbon dioxide amounts to create predictions about temperature, humidity, precipitation, radiation, and wind velocity. And these different scenarios are made by different groups around the world. So there's going to be variation between them based on those calculations, but they all do expect warming to occur. And so how we picked these scenarios was we chose ones that vary in temperature and wetness to see which combination most affects grassland production. And we chose to look at our projections in the mid-21st century, 2040 to 2069, and looked at the season of summer. And if you look at the axes, the x-axis talks about the change in precipitation, while the y-axis is change in PET, which is directly related to temperature. And the last thing to notice here are there are two types of emission scenarios. So we have the pink dots, which are high emission scenarios, and the yellow dots, which are low emission scenarios. And we chose two from each. So now I'll hand it over to Lauren to talk about our results.
So using these climate models, we took this data and plugged it into Matplotlib in order to create these graphs as you see it on this slide. This graph in particular is the one for the high precipitation and higher temperatures climate model. So tying it back to our initial research question on what is the future path of climate and grassland productivity, we want to look at the green line in this graph here, which is the line for the water deficit or this PET minus precipitation. Now, this is a dry climate, so PET is always going to be greater, and this was proven in all of our data. And basically, that just means that the atmosphere is more thirsty than the water that is being supplied into the ecosystem. So on the next slide, we took the green line from that graph and created this time series graph, which shows all of the climate projections for productivity from 2020 to 2099. And as you can see in each of these scenarios, there is no clear trend, as every scenario kind of varies a bit as the years go on. But it is important to note that each projection does predict an overall decrease in productivity, which Brody will go into more in a numerical sense in the following slides. But we noticed here that the red line, which is the dry and hot model, is usually the lowest. And the orange line, which is the dry and warm model, is usually the highest overall. So tying it back to another one of our research questions on what affects grassland productivity the most, we want to remember that this water deficit line accounts for both temperature and precipitation. So to further understand this graph, we went back to our historical data to ask ourselves if this water deficit is an accurate way to project future productivity. So on the next slide, here's a graph that we've shown a couple times now, but this is the historical productivity versus the water deficit. And as you can see, there is a pretty direct correlation as the R-squared value is pretty high. So here you can see that the lower water deficit means that there is a higher productivity, which makes sense because if there's more evapotranspiration, like if the atmosphere is more thirsty due to these high temperatures, then there'll be less water present within these grassland ecosystems, making them less productive, obviously. So on the next slide, just to hammer this point home, we plotted productivity versus just temperature. And as you can see, there's barely any correlation at all, which emphasizes that these ecosystems rely more on the relationship between how much precipitation is received, as well as how much the temperature is rising, which is accurately depicted using water deficit. So now Brody will go into a more numerical analysis of our results.
So yeah, going back to that graph that Lauren had just showed of the 4 different climate scenarios, the future climate projections, we decided to compare them against the historical average ANPP values from 1982 to 2019 of the Weld County location. So that the historical average from that time period was 932.029 pounds per acre. And so we decided to compare each of the different future climate projections against that historical value. And we saw a range of nearly 12% decrease as seen in the hot and dry future climate projection, and then a 2% decrease in the highest ANPP future climate projection of the warm and wet model. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, what we saw with this is that ANPP, the average ANPP value is going to be decreasing in all of the future climate projections. So it's just kind of looking into the future that they think no matter what the climate scenario is, there's going to be a decrease in average ANPP, ranging from 2 to 12% in the ones that we looked at. There are some extreme cases that have some scenarios that predict up to a 50% reduction in ANPP values, but unfortunately didn't have the time to get to study those more extreme cases and focused on just the ones that we decided. And then just to hammer it home, as we've explained a bunch, that the ANPP values had the highest reduction in the hot and dry climate projections. Next slide. So next steps, we just have this super large collab notebook has reproducible code. We can use it to look at new climate projections, a bunch of different locations, and hopefully get to looking at the future projections of our different locations in the Texas and Bismarck locations. We also wanted to look at the relationship between ANPP and other climate factors, just to see how other things going on in the environment are affecting the ANPP, if it's not just PET, precip and stuff like that. And we'd also like to look into the analysis of just extreme responses and what's going to be looking like in the future for the grasslands. And again, just thank you. Special thanks to our mentors, Bill Travis, Prasad Thada, Imtiaz. They were a huge help in gathering us all the data, keeping us motivated, keeping us on track. And a huge thank to Nate, Nathan, Lauren, everyone else that helped us throughout the entire summer. It was super awesome working with everybody. Thank you.